Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the DM Integration latest webinar. You're almost welcome. This one, we're going to focus on the competitiveness of future supply chains. And the statement I make at the beginning here is that in our view, the future supply chain competitiveness will not be product versus product. In fact, we would argue that as technology and business develop, there is a great deal of convergence between product. Perhaps the most obvious or most illustrative would be the car industry. If you get behind any hatchback of today on the road, I think it's pretty difficult to determine which is which. Obviously, the label tells us that, but if you look at the actual products, they all perform very well. They all have leather seats. They all have music. They all have ABS. They all have the same features effectively. And I think this is common in many products today. So if the product isn't going to be the differentiator, what is? And I would argue that the differentiator in the future is actually going to be our supply chain. And at the heart of that supply chain actually is our people. I once remember listening to somebody speak who said, if you take the people out of a business, what is left? Well, you have a factory. With no people in it, that will just simply eventually decay and fall over. You have product. That product with no people dealing with the product will eventually rust, collapse, and disappear. So actually, if you take away people from a business, actually you're not taking away something, you're taking away everything. So what you'll see as we go through here today is that, yeah, there are some process issues associated to good supply chains and good business management, but actually at the heart of all of that lies our people. Our total model, therefore, is what we refer to as integrated business excellence, which we would see as a both top to bottom and side to side model. Top to bottom meaning every organization has some objective, some vision, some mission that they are trying to achieve and move towards. That is defined through a series of strategic business objectives, and it is leadership's job to actually execute that strategy. That's what they're there to do. So it's execution of strategy at the very top here. On the next slide, you're going to see something that fits in that gap area, which we see as integrated business management. But below that, there are a series of more detailed processes. So portfolio management, customer and demand management, supply chain management, and underpinning all of those things. Of course, they're not the only detailed processes we have, but will be financial processes as well. But underpinning all of that is the idea that we can never rest on our laurels. Continuous improvement has to be embedded into our organization. And that actually speaks to the thing on the next line there, which is change management. You hear a very common message from many people that people are resistant to change. Well, in the future, organizations need to love change because change is here forever. And without change, we will not survive. I think it's quite interesting that if you look back into the year 1900, which I know is a long time away, but in the scheme of things, it's just more than 100 years away. But if you look back into the year 1900 and you look at the Fortune 500 companies, now, not being a Fortune 500 company doesn't make you perfect, it doesn't make you great, but it's a measure of success. If you look back to that time, 90% of those companies no longer exist. So by the definition of being in the Fortune 500 is some signal of success, just over 100 years later, 90% of them aren't doing well, aren't doing not so well, are not here at all. So change management and therefore people development is a critical factor. We often see the development of technology, we often see the development of processes, but how much real effort have we put into people development? Because it is critical to our future. It's critical to the future of our business, the future of our supply chains, and the future of our success. People will always behave the way they get measured. So the line below is focused upon the KPIs, the performance measures, and the critical success factors. If we want to be successful in the future, the first thing we need to do is to define what behaviors do we want from our people, and then put measures in which will achieve those behaviors. Not the other way around. We can all think of measures, but actually the question is posed in the wrong sequence, in my view. The first question should be, what behavior do you want? If you don't do that, you will get the behavior you deserve. So think through that very carefully in terms of our future designs. And then a very boring topic at the bottom there for most people. Some people will be very excited by data, but most of us not so. However, just in the way the diagram shows, it absolutely underpins everything we do. Data quality in most organizations is not high. It is not valued. It is not measured. As a consequence, it is very poor. It is not that many years ago when, in a survey of roughly 542 companies, which was claimed to be global but actually was European, that the bill of material accuracy data in that survey, and this was across all industry types, so food, pharmaceutical, process, automotive, engineering, etc., but the bill of material accuracy from that survey was 44%. The stock record accuracy was 42%. Now those are just two elements of data, but actually pretty critical in terms of supply chain planning. And with that level of information, and then of course you top that with how good is the average forecast, then planning and supply chain management become incredibly difficult. So while it may not be the highest thing on the agenda in terms of excitement, it is critical for all of our futures and future supply chains. So if we go back to that gap area, so the leadership team are there to execute that strategy. The process that helps us do that is what used to be known as S&OP, Sales and Operations Planning, and has now evolved and continues to evolve into Integrated Business Planning. There's nothing particularly new and different about this particular slide. For a long time now, supply chain experts like ourselves have quoted SOP and Integrated Business Planning as a 5-step process. Those 5 steps were portfolio or product, demand, supply, financial, and the leadership team. So that is a standard 5-step, so-called 5-step process. What you see, however, that we've added to this is the leadership development review. We did that for a very specific reason, and that is back to the beginning of this little webinar, where we see people development as a critical factor. I remember working with the Mars company in Dubai, and the HR lady challenged me by saying, so you keep going on about people in this process, where do people fit into the process? Of course, my answer as a consultant was trying to buy time, and my answer was everywhere, which of course is not particularly helpful. So she challenged me again, and eventually we came up with the idea of saying, well, we ought to have a people development review in here. This is not about hiring and firing. This is about developing those people to be with the capability and the resources for our future. Again, if you look at many of the surveys, if you look at the top 500 executives in the world, or top 500 CEOs in the world, and ask them what keeps them awake at night, in other words, what's top of mind, you will find a very large percentage of those people list in their first 3 things the attraction, retention, and development of people. Therefore, if this is such a critical issue to business success in the future, where does it fit into the integrated business planning process? And our view of IBP is that it is the process, not another process. It is the process by which the leadership team manage the organization. Hence, we found a home for it, and we put that 4th step in there of people development. There was then a catch-all in many ways in terms of the PMO review. That PMO review is to say, well, if IBP is to become the process by which we manage our organization, there will be other cross-functional projects, cross-functional activities that have a big impact. So the most common quote would be for those that have implemented an ERP system, perhaps SAP, for example. Does the implementation of SAP cost us money? Well, of course it does, quite a lot. Does the implementation of SAP impact our business, have an effect on our business? Is it disruptive in our business? Well, for sure it is. And does it always go smoothly? Well, very often not. It's going to have a big impact across the whole organization. And it's nothing to do with SAP. It could be any ERP or systems implementation. It could be a factory extension. It could be an office move. It could be any of those things. If they are significant business issues, where do they get into the process of managing the organization? And once again, we've added that very specific review at the top there to cover the other projects, major projects across the organization. Some people might refer to that as project management office, but it's a catch-all for those other significant things. The objective of any IBP process is to identify the gap. So we have those strategic objectives, we have those strategic plans, we have that vision, and that is what we're trying to aim for. IBP is looking across the horizon that is probably in the order of 24 months. It could be further, depending on the industry type. But we're looking at that, and what the outcome of IBP is telling us is what we refer to here as truth as we know it. In other words, what do we honestly believe will happen? Truth as we know it. Now, if you then compare that to what we would like to happen, which is my strategic plan, those things are very often ambitious. So my strategic plan, my annual operating plan or budget are setting ambition for the organization. The strategic plan is a little bit like you say to your kids when they're growing up. You know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the annual operating plan is what we have committed to our shareholders. If, of course, truth as we know it, what comes out of IBP every month is the same as either our strategic plan and our annual operating plan, then that's marvelous. You know, yippee, let's go home and rejoice. However, very often they will not be. And that is what we refer to as the gap. Now, that gap could be a financial gap, it could be a revenue gap, it could be a profit gap, it could be a resource gap, it could be a capacity gap, it could be a capability gap, it could be a people gap. It's just a gap. And the job of IBP is to identify that gap and do something about it. In other words, close it. I've had questions in the past where people say, well, what happens if there is no gap? Well, in my opinion, there is always a gap. Because if there is no negative gap, which is where typically our mindsets go to when we mention the word gap, but if there's no negative gap, there is the opportunity to open up a positive gap. So more revenue, more profit, different resource. How do we do better? In other words, IBP is not about simply minding the gap. It is about driving competitiveness and ambition and growth into our organizations. So I will argue that there is never a time when there is no gap. There's either one to close or there's one to open. One of my clients last year referred to this as grasping the gap. It's quite a vivid phrase, grasping the gap, in terms of how do I drive growth into my organization. There's another important word that ties back into the people discussion here, and that is truth. So one of the questions we would ask, and I've asked this question to many executives in my life, in this organization, is it safe to tell the truth? Now, out of the hundreds of executives I've asked that question to, nobody has ever said to me, no, I would like people to lie to me. Everybody has said, my door's always open, there's no blame here, and I want to know the truth. But then, of course, somebody sat by my side has leaned over and quietly said, yes, the last person that told the truth doesn't work here anymore. Now, sometimes it's not hire and fire in that sense, but it could be isn't seen in a good light, isn't seen as positive, isn't promoted, is seen as negative. So my question to all of us is it truly safe to tell the truth in your organization? Or is it safer to tell people what they want to hear and beg forgiveness afterwards? Now, of course, telling the truth and being open is all about developing people in a style of genuine leadership, which we're going to sort of move on to as we move through here. Because as I said to begin with, people are at the heart of any competitive direction, any growth. It is all down to people, and of course, people is all down to the way we treat them. So what we would say is there is a sweet spot of this integration. The sweet spot of the organization is within the organization structure. So whatever we find ourselves, we don't set out to change the organization structure, although you've seen that many times, I'm sure, where it's a little bit like moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. We've gone from a functional structure to a matrix structure and back to a functional structure. So what we're trying to drive at is a set of processes and behaviors that are operating within the organization structure that you have. We're not trying to fit the organization to business excellence or IBP, quite the opposite. We're trying to fit IBP to the organization. But within inside that, there is the integration of systems, tools, processes, and people. Where we at DMI focus on is largely the sweet spot, which is the center, but largely the people and process intersection. We have systems background, and many of us in the organization have had experience in those areas, but that's not our bag. We describe ourselves as systems agnostic. In other words, we don't mind what systems you use as long as we aim at that sweet spot. Now, quite obviously, we have stolen that sweet spot. Tiger Woods. And I remember doing it. It was 1983, if I recall. The difference, of course, is that he plays it 68 times a round. In other words, he lives and breathes there and occasionally misses. I pass and usually miss. That is the difference between world-class companies and non-world-class companies. They live and breathe in that spot, whereas world-class companies pass through it occasionally. Non-world-class companies, I'm sorry, pass through it occasionally. At the heart of all of this is back to that people issue, which we're going to sort of explore a little further as we go forward now. So when we look at the difference, John Anderson was the CEO of Citicorp and indeed was the person recognized as the turnaround king at Burger King. But he distinguished very well, I think, between the difference between management and leadership. So management gives you a position. It does not give you leadership. You need to earn leadership by the way you behave and you develop. People are looking for leaders. In his words, people hate bosses because that's spelt double SOB. People want a leader. We seek leadership because we want to follow. Leaders are not moody. I've heard people described in my past as, oh, he's having a bad day or she's having a bad day. That is not what leaders do. Leaders are constantly consistent in their behavior. We refer to it, as you'll see a little later, as impeccable behavior. They're not arrogant and they trust people. sum this up very well by what he said here: taking care of your employees, and they'll take care of your business. And it's as simple as that. And I agree with him. I think it is as simple as that. If we get people engaged in our organization, engaged with ourselves, willing to follow our leadership, willing to buy into the vision and mission we have for the organization, which has clearly been communicated, and they have empathy with that vision, then that is where your competitive advantage comes from. It is the people who give us this situation, not the process, not the product, which, as I said earlier, is almost certainly converging in most industries we see today. So I think the way Branson summed this up was very on the money. If we can get people to engage with us, then we will have that advantage that we seek. So people respond to leadership, as I've just said, but they also respond to a vision. I think people want to know where we're going. And by vision, I don't mean the vision is to be the biggest or to make a profit or to grow. That's not a vision. Those things are always the consequence of a vision achieved as compared to the vision themselves. So what is the why? What is the purpose of your organization? What is the purpose and what is the why of the functions and the individuals in that organization? And can we all align to what that purpose is? That's what we mean by a vision. But however, they also respond to measures, and that's the target issue in here. If you measure me irrationally, then you don't have to be a genius to work out that I'm going to behave irrationally. If you measure me in a different way that supports that vision, then we will follow and pursue that direction and gain that advantage. And then I've used the word before, impeccable behavior. People are watching, so leaders in position, the rest of the organization will watch those people for what they looking for is impeccable behavior. What I mean by that is they will look for every little last throwaway line, every little email, every little conversation heard in the canteen or in the corridor, every little bit of body language. In a moment, you're going to see something about body language, and by impeccable behavior, we mean always consistently behaving in a way that communicates the direction and vision that we want to go in. So the vision is our created future. So if we want to be competitive in the future, then we have to create a vision that is making more improvement, environment, excellence, etc., development. I'm fairly convinced that somebody's made a fortune with a random word generator, because what does that really mean? Who's going to put on the wall of their reception, "We'd like to be rubbish"? Well, of course we don't want to be rubbish. What the extended vision does is explain to people and share with people the characteristics both of process and behavior. So take a very simple one. The characteristic might be that all of our data is impeccable, that we value that data, that those are describing the characteristics of that vision. And that's the bit that people need to understand and buy into. And then it helps us understand what capabilities and skills that we need to acquire or develop or retain. In other words, back to all of that people development side of our integration. Very famously, Peter Drucker, the consultant from back in the 60s and 70s, asked this question, to 3 stonecutters, why are you cutting stones? The first one, because I need the money. It's a job, it pays the wages, it pays the mortgage rather. The second one, because I'm good at it. Yeah, I like doing this, I'm pretty good at it. But the third one, his answer was, because I'm building a cathedral. In other words, a much greater purpose. I believe that you will get much more competitiveness, much more support, much more loyalty from the third stonecutter in this little illustration than either of the first 2. Hence, we will be achieving that growth and competitiveness that we have desired. I like the illustration. I know it's very old, but I think it's very, very visual. So how top managers, how leaders behave, and that's important, how they behave and what they really believe about their people and how they treat them will largely determine how well the company is going to do in the future. So notice the word behave at the top there. It's how they are behaving, which is key. And so hence the difference between leadership and management. So managers administer things, leaders innovate things. Managers is a copy. We do this process. Leaders originate things. Managers maintain things, leaders develop things. Managers focus on systems and structure. Leaders absolutely, top of the tree, focus on people. Managers rely on control. Leaders rely on people and trust. Hence, the two of those two things go hand in hand. Managers tend to be more short-term. Leaders think of the future with a long-term perspective. Managers ask how and when. Leaders ask why. Again, tying into the purpose and vision, and the answer to the why is key to getting people to change. In fact, let me just pause there for a second. People do not change. We said earlier that we want people to love change. People do not change because they understand how to do things. They change because they understand why they do things. So I've used an illustration for that for many years. I live near a town in the UK here called Chester. This story would be applicable in any city in the world, virtually, I think. But in Chester, there is a park. It's called Grosvenor Park. If you walk around Grosvenor Park, you find flower beds and lawns and gardens, and it's a very nice place. But what you see on the grass are signs that say no ball games on the grass. Guess what you see happening? Yeah, you've got it. You see kids playing football on the grass, oftentimes using their sign as a goalpost with their parents sat on park benches. Now, my question is, why is that? Is it because those parents can't read? I would claim not. I would claim that those parents learned how to read several years ago. I would argue that it's because they don't know why. If the sign, on the other hand, had said, no ball games on the grass because there's poisonous snakes in it, then I think you'd find a different scene. Kids do need to play, but the parent would direct them not to play where the poisonous snakes are. They would direct them to play in a safe area. That's because the answer to the why is what's driven the change, not the answer to the how. And that's what I think leaders do. They answer the why. So leaders always have an eye on the bottom line. Leaders have an eye on the horizon, the future, in other words. Managers imitate, leaders originate. Managers accept how things are. We're doing okay, aren't we? Leaders challenge that. The great Jack Welch constantly challenged the performance of his people by looking at the bottom 10% of the organization every year. He didn't rely on that. I remember him sending out an instruction to all of his CEOs of the companies that he was in charge of that said, change everything now. Many of the responses he got were, but Jack, we're doing really well. He said, exactly. That is exactly the time to change everything. Managers are good soldiers. They're good eggs. Leaders do their own thing, and managers do things right, whereas leaders do the right things. So there is not very subtle in my opinion, but there is a distinction between those two sets of characteristics, and I believe we need to be driving not just the top guys to the right-hand column, but all of us to the right-hand column. And part of that issue is around communication. I think it's a very fascinating understanding that says 93% of communication is in fact non-verbal. So if 93% is non-verbal, then it's all about behavior. It's about the way we speak. It's about where we speak. It's about how we behave. It's about what time we turn up for meetings. It's about what we say on email. It's about the things we throw away in one-off statements or on the plane or at home, etc. So we need to learn to impeccably behave means we need to learn to communicate non-verbally. After all, as it states here, 93% of which is indeed non-verbal. Only 7%, therefore, is what we say. We need to learn how to listen. One of my challenges to all of you would be, at the moment, whatever you're doing, you hopefully are indeed listening to what I'm saying, but there will be other things on your mind. There'll be people coming into your office. There'll be, it's coming up to lunchtime, what are we having for lunch? What am I doing this evening? What about that meeting I'm going to later on? There will be a number of other voices in your head. Practice with your people, turning off all of those voices and listening to them. I remember some time ago when I went through some of this development for myself, I was with and we'd actually go there. In other words, turning off all of the little voices in your head. It was interesting because the next day my colleague came back to the meeting and was asked, "Did you do your homework?" Oh yes, he said. So oh, what happened? He said, "Oh, it was terrible." He said, "My wife accused me of having an affair." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because she said, you are listening to me, and you never listen to me. It is, and the brain is So that was Mike. Mike is the supply chain manager in an organization called Coveris. And as you can see here, he attended one of the Horses for Change leadership development sessions. Might seem strange, he said it's unique. It might seem strange that we use horses in this way, but the issue with horses is that they look for leaders, and they look for leaders in the wild naturally to protect them and to feel safe. Hence, we refer to the style of leadership we're promoting here as secure-based leadership. Secure-based leadership comes from another sporting activity, which is climbing. If you look at a guy climbing a rock, he'll have his colleague or his partner on the belay on the rope at the bottom. So if you watch that carefully, interestingly, the guy at the bottom will let the chap on the rock take his own line. In other words, make his own decisions. He'll even let him make mistakes. In fact, he'll even let him fall off the rock, but he won't let him hit the floor. In other words, he has his back. He is a secure base. And when we look for leaders in our organization, and when we look for leadership in our organization, that is the style of leadership we want. We want somebody to have our back that we can feel safe with. Now, horses communicate and look for leaders all the time, but actually they can't speak. They can actually, but they don't speak English. So they are communicating through body language, and they are observing our own body language. Hence Mike's comment about the persona I thought I was giving off. It was not really the one that people perceived from me. Hence the, as we call it here, experiential learning element of this is incredibly powerful if we want to develop that leadership element in our organization. Even, in fact, the way we draw the organization chart traditionally, as in the left-hand side of the slide here, there is a boss and there's, hierarchy going down. Even drawing it the opposite way round has a psychological impact. I'm not just playing semantics here, but if you look at the right-hand side, then that leader at the bottom of the chart has the back. He is the belay, or she is the belay rope of all of the people. I remember the greatest leader that I have ever had the privilege of working with was a guy called Godfrey Stomer. He was the managing director of several British American tobacco companies I worked with, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, China, Malaysia. And I remember him saying, I know nothing about the tobacco industry. Well, that wasn't true. He knew a lot, but he said, I know nothing about the tobacco industry. I simply surround myself with great people, inspire and develop them like hell. And that Godfrey, this is not where the chart comes from, but Godfrey could very easily be that person at the bottom of the right-hand chart. He absolutely saw himself as being in a position of inspiring and protecting and being the back of his people. There is a book that I would highly recommend people read, which is called, it's by a guy called David Marquardt, and it's called Turn the Ship Around. And I think this is a remarkable situation in the environment he was in. He was the captain of the worst performing submarine in the US Navy. And he turned it into the best performing submarine in the US Navy, hence the phrase, turn the ship around. And he did it by saying, if I have to give all of the orders out and people have to follow me, which of course is very traditional in the services, then I would have to be the expert in everything in this ship or this boat. And there are something like 1,000 miles of cable in this boat. Therefore, I would have to be the expert in every single system we have. The way he achieved his objective was, rather than traditionally saying to the periscope officer, up periscope, that's my order, and that's how it would have worked. He turned it into saying, no, I'm not going to do anything. You tell me, Captain, I'm about to up periscope. And if I don't stop you doing that because you're about to kill us all, in other words, I've got your back, then please carry on and up periscope, because you are the expert. And that's what you find in business. Everybody is an expert in their own 3 square yards. And And therefore our skill and our objective of management and indeed leadership is to coach the best out of those 3 square yards, not to tell people what to do. So even just drawing this chart this way round, I think is an interesting illustration of what we really mean by leadership. And I think this all ties back into some phrases from a guy called Joel Barker, which vision without action is just dreaming. Action without vision is just passing the time, we're just doing stuff. Whereas vision with action can indeed change the world, or indeed change our organization into that competitive environment. So I would finish by saying, in my view, a desk is a dangerous place from which to see the world. You have to get out there and be with people and lead those people, communicate with those people. Remember, 93% of which is non-verbal. And I don't think you can run a company by PowerPoint. Having said that, we've just spent 45 minutes looking at PowerPoint, so hopefully that has not been too difficult for you or too much of a waste of time. My encouragement would be that we take on board the real competitive weapon for our future supply chains and our future businesses, and that is definitely to develop leadership at all levels in our organization, throughout our organization, and focus on the attraction and retention of people. Okay, guys, that was all I was going to say based upon the PowerPoints. Thank you all very much for listening. If anybody has any questions, then we are online here to take on board any of those questions. So over to you guys. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please fire away. I'll give you a few minutes to do that if you so choose. While you're thinking, then we did have a question posed to us earlier, which was that we've spoken about people and processes and that sweet spot, but where does technology fit into this? In other words, systems and other forms of technology. And I think it has a place. I have clearly focused most of my message around people and to some degree the development of leading edge processes. But technology has a place. What I think, however, is that without we focus upon the why, then the technology is simply a faster form of doing things that we do already. So the why will focus on change. If we do not take people with us in that way and get that buy-in, then the technology just does what we've always done, perhaps faster. Question, if we always do what we've always done, we're always going to get what we've always got. If we want to be more competitive, indeed if we have to be more competitive in a ever more competitive world, then I think the technology can only support us when integrated with people and process. Any other questions, guys? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. If you need to be in contact with us or would like to be in contact with us, please, of course, don't hesitate to do so, either at DM Integration Limited or indeed Horses for Change. Again, thank you very much for your time, guys.